Who's our timer? What's our name?
Oh.
Taj.
Yep, I'm ready.
Yeah, I just want to ask you what you guys think any of this means.
What we
That's
think,
my,
what?
that's my question. What any of this means,
Uh-huh.
In regards to what?
just in general.
Okay, I have a couple of questions for you too. What is the medium in these two?
That's ink
On the big one?
on tracing paper, and then the other one's just a digital print.
A reduced digital print?
Yeah.
Okay. And these are all from outside, or you were actually working on it?
Yeah, plein air, watercolor.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, the floor is open. Jillian Moore, you look so bright and wide awake.
I don't know, I thought I was the V game in the room.
I knew there was one.
No, I don't know, maybe I'm just being kind of a curmudgeon this morning, but I'm curious, Joe, like how you feel about the sort of departure that your work has taken, and I guess I'm not gonna ask you that question. I'll just be grumpy that you haven't even tried to answer it. No, I mean, I think I'm really excited by just seeing the difference between the room today and the room in the last final review, where it seems like you've been doing so much experimentation.
So much fun.
Experimentation. I've always been really interested in the way that your plein air practice and your sort of observational practice feeds into your studio practice. And it seemed much more sort of one-to-one, looking at your last works, like you could sort of see the ways in which almost the sort of empiricism of your plein air drawing and painting was really limiting, like what you were able to express on canvas in the studio. At least that's sort of like the feeling that I got. And now I feel like you've sort of broken free from that entirely. So they seem now to be sort of two very different projects.
When I walked in the room, I was like, whose work is this? I just really didn't recognize it, just because of the versatility that you've demonstrated for us.
I can jump in. Jose, everybody.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I meant to introduce him. Jose Ruiz, Director of Curatorial Studies, is our guest critic today, and also next week.
Sweet.
Jose Ruiz.
All this work is new to me, right? And obviously you asked a big question. I think there's different meanings in the different types of work here. There are, of course, a bunch of different things happening in styles, right? I think for me right now, I think I need to sit with it a little bit, but in a work like that, where someone's looking at it back there's a good amount of information that I can spend time with it and kind of like navigate through the drawing, the painting, and I start to get some meaning from there. Others, I think, and even this one, to be frank, for some people this would have maybe less, or maybe it's more minimal, but there is something there that pulls me in to look at it, right, for longer, maybe as long as something as dense as that. And then in here, I'm sort of seeing more of like exploration. So I haven't seen the previous work, but I think it is. It's a sign that you're willing to break away from plein air to more realistic painting, to deconstructing the canvas and experiment. So I'm still kind of sinking into that. Right?
I think like the thing about the piece in the back is I'm just like, oh, cool, conspiracy theory. And I think that there was this piece of the work that was always, I remember the last final review, it was kind of a similar situation where it's like a lot of different stuff going on. And the feeling was like, okay, where's the traction here? Like, where's this gonna go? Like, what are you most interested in? And I remember at the time kind of feeling that, or understanding that you would come in making a certain kind of work, and you were trying to like find ways to make new work. And so that's just how I receive what's happening here too. And like, I think given that this is the end of your second semester of graduate school, it's not necessarily a bad place to be. But it is, it does feel kind of like a restatement of the problem, where it's like, each one of these things has a different aesthetic, or a conceptual frame that seems to be at stake in it. And I don't really see the way that the one inquiry is like inflecting the other. Yeah, I mean, we could open that up with like looking at some specific work, but I kind of just wanted to like say that this is how I'm receiving it. When you ask like, what does it mean? I think it means like, I'm trying to figure it out.
Jess, what do you make of it?
I mean, I agree with that for sure. I feel like they do feel like they're kind of separate explorations, almost each individual section of the room. But I feel like the confidence has grown quite a bit since last final review.
Confidence.
Yeah, there's like, I feel even in these sort of like just plein air paintings, I feel more like this kind of cheekiness that I felt in your earlier work. There's something, I feel like there's like a joke or something that I'm not sure I quite get, but I feel like you're making or you're proposing. I personally am kind of attracted to this piece over here. Like, I do think it really grabs my attention and holds it. It makes me kind of think of like David Diao or something. Like, there's something about the surface and the support that interests me. But I do kind of search for maybe more of a consistent working in one of these lanes and really kind of like showing a group that holds its own.
I'm going to pick up on that, because I agree with that. I think something that's interesting about the landscape ones is, and it, maybe this is connected just to the thing about the joke or possible joke, you know, is the sort of, each one is a monument. I can't see that in the one on the far left. So maybe it's not true that, or I just can't see it. But the repetition of that motif gives you some kind of legibility to the project, you know. And the fact that these monuments are centered in the composition in a kind of, you know, blatantly obvious way, that's not a negative thing necessarily. But that part of it is intriguing to me, and different from what you were doing in the plein air things before, where they were just kind of scenes, you know. So focusing the attention on these, the way the forms intrude into the, you know, really banal kind of academic setting that surrounds them is interesting. I think for me that's the most coherent statement of an idea. You were talking about what they mean. That's the most coherent statement of an idea in the room. I have other things to say about other things, but I'm going to stop there for the moment.
Well, there's also, the thing about those pieces is that there's kind of a questioning of like the futility of art or like the stupidity of it. Mm-hmm. And the thing about these public artworks is that they're contrived so that you have very particular point of view. Like its relationship to its site is like heavily circumscribed. And it's circumscribed by like the area that it could be contained in, but like the things that are around it that are like allegedly being like, I don't know, beautified, I guess, or by like these, I mean, I think there is a derisive term that originated around this kind of installation, which is like plop art. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, here's a thing, I put it in there. And so I think that, and the other thing is the technique is very kind of amateurish in a way, and the idea of making plein air watercolors is kind of a, it's almost like something that a hobbyist might do, or like a Sunday painter, and the way that they're painted is actually not really like the way that, it's like not good watercolor technique. It's just sort of like using watercolor almost against itself in some ways. In some places it's like almost more like you're using a gouache, like they're very opaque instead of being built up through translucent layers, which is like not a problem one way or the other, it's just an observation. But I also think that the way that they're transcribed with this kind of banal local color, where it's like, this is what it looks like. It all feels to me kind of similarly desperate in terms of being like, what's the point of this? Like, what am I supposed to be doing? And so we're like, why does anyone want this stuff where it is?
Well, I think that really gives me words for, that's the joke somehow.
Yeah, I think that's intentional.
Yeah, no, I think so too.
Yeah.
And I think that what it reminds me of is the Ebouche parking lots or something like that. I mean, the naivete of the watercolor technique comes across as a kind of deadpan.
Yeah.
And there is something intrinsically hilarious about the way that fashions in high art appear, various decades in relation to this kind of bland campus pleasant architecture. I mean, like the Richard Serra tilted arc thing in the middle of the Government Plaza, just a complete lack of any relationship between the trends of thought of the campus and the public art that's being inserted into it. I mean, I think the joke is actually lighter than that, or not. I'm sort of, it sounds heavier when you put it in words. But, yeah, there's something like that going on there to me.
But also the dolphins to me are the funniest because they're kind of like the most ersatz art or something. And it like makes the least amount of sense. Like, well, why do you have dolphins like jumping in this little tiny pool? That's kind of horrible when you think about it. It like makes you think of like, dolphins being imprisoned in aquariums and stuff. And it's like, we all know they should be free. So why are they like jumping in this like little kiddie pool? It's like really, but it's like, I think that's really funny, like because it's almost more like ball art, basically. But I also think the problem with like public art is that everything has to go through like committees and costs a lot of money, and you have like the government is involved, like you have like zoning laws and shit, and it means that there's all these like barriers in which all these people have to get on board, and it like kind of creates this really circumscribed place where there's very little that can be done. And in a public artwork that isn't stupid, I think. So there's your lecture on that. And I think that this is kind of a hilarious project, like the idea of like going around and just doing these like, because the other thing is the point of plein air painting theoretically should be that you're going to observe the fleeting transience of a particular vista that is like really beautiful.
The light, the weather.
And then this is kind of like all of that is sort of reduced here to reinscribing the very specific image that like one of the very few images that one could even have of this thing by its design. And so I think like, that's kind of funny. It's like could be like an atlas of public art, but that's like a conceptual project. It feels to me less like a painting project than like a conceptual project that is funny.
Yeah, I was gonna pick up on that. Like usually in plein air painting, the artist finds a space or a landscape that they think is beautiful, it's changing, they want to capture it, and they're kind of racing with time, right? And here it's interesting. Maybe that's part of the joke. I'm not sure if it's meant to be a joke, but that it's a pretty banal setting, right? Mm-hmm. Pretty objective. And other viewers in this space outside of the painter probably have a similar vista, which is not better than the other, right? I think though there may be a connection between this work, that work, and this work in terms of this idea of like the commons, right? Like whether that's imaginary, right? And then here we see, civic, potentially some civic architecture in the background, but these sort of public spaces where people come and go that are pretty neutralized. I think that there is a recurring theme in these three things, right? That maybe I'm not sure that's subconscious, right? Or maybe your interpretation of walking through space, walking through cities, but there seems to be a connection there.
I would actually really agree with that, and when you said that, it made me think of all of your work is really about gatherings in public spaces. All of the scenes that you create, all of the different colors and all of that are really people gathering in these common spaces. And I wonder also how these pieces influence these pieces, because I think that there's some things that you do differently in the perspective of the space in this one and this one. And I feel like these kind of would be helpful in informing how you lay out the spaces in some of the more complicated pieces that you paint. I saw that when I was sick that day and I watched it.
Which one?
This one in the corner. I was sick the day you showed it, and I wanted to come to your studio and just didn't have time to see it up close. I am, with these pieces, excited to see that you listened to some of the feedback, particularly from Stephen, about varying the strokes, so everything is not the same. And I spent a little bit of time today kind of looking at it and trying to like really articulate how that creates a difference in the experience that I'm having with these pieces. And I think it does an interesting thing with like pulling certain figures and pulling certain things out to the front that I think is like a really fruitful exploration in thinking about like what is important in this composition and how do you like let me know as the viewer, like what am I supposed to be looking at? Am I supposed to be looking at the top, the middle, the bottom, and like experimenting more with the ways that you let the stroke tell me what is coming forward and what is coming out. And I think that there's some spaces in these where you do it in a certain way, like, and I don't know if it's like shading, because like, and it's parts maybe that aren't even important, but like the tree in this one in the corner is lifted forward in a very specific way. And so I think thinking about how that applies to these more complicated paintings can be really helpful exploration for you. But you have to talk about your paintings. Like, we need to hear from you, like, what is your painting? It's not, I can't pour into you what you're supposed to paint or what you feel called to paint. You have to, like, take hold of your narrative or take hold of, because if I'm telling you, like, this is what your painting's about, and then you're just like, okay, that's what my painting's about. Like, if you don't give us anything, we can't feed you.
That's, on the 4 paintings over here, my problem with these about talking about what they're about is that I have no idea, because they're like drive-by glancing attempts at something. And I can't tell because there's not enough there yet to see what the train of thought is. And as Jared said, they all attach to really different art historical lineages. So, you know, hypothetically, any of them could yield some kind of fruit. But I don't know where that's going yet. They're almost like, you know, stylistic postage stamps or something, you know, or baseball cards. I mean, that could become a thing, but it's not a thing yet.
How's it going, Joe, with learning about some contemporary artists? Have you sort of found anything that...
I haven't been able to go to many art museums lately, but I am going to do that over the summer a lot.
What about like through books or is there...
Yeah, I've been sort of looking through books. I've been hitting the library a bit, but I definitely should be a little more.
I have a thought, and I don't know.
A little louder,
I
man.
have a thought. I don't know if you'll use it, but it's more of like a kind of like a way to think whenever I'm stuck in this kind of position where I don't know what I'm hitting, and I'm hitting a lot of random things. So I usually compose everything in my studio, so like all be in one composition, and then I'll start drawing from it.
You mean actual objects?
Yeah, like I would, if it was me, I would put all these paintings on one wall in my studio and just draw and paint from it to see what I'm connecting and what's not connecting, to kind of figure out what I'm actually trying to say. I don't know if that might help, but.
How did it feel to make these? I mean, I think some of the feedback that you've gotten is like kind of about the sensitivity to the narrative within the piece, where it sort of connects, maybe, for lack of a word, on a meta level, rather than just a stylistic one. And so I know some of the feedback that you've gotten was maybe to try to paint from life, just to sort of, as a sensitivity training to, and I do think that these are quite beautiful, that there's a lot of light in them, a different relationship to color. I mean, the color is still very, very local. The grass is always green, the bricks are always the same kind of red, but even within that, there's a little bit more kind of grace in how the combinations of like, you know, I think that the way that those red bricks like feel up against the different greens feels kind of like a nice, more softer color relationship. I also think that the materiality of the piece in the back on the tracing paper has a different thoughtfulness. I mean, that might just be, you know, even in the way those two pieces of paper meet, I also sort of found myself a little bit more engaged with trying to sort of figure out who are these people, what are they doing? I mean, there's a kind of group of people that seems like there may be in danger of some kind of violence. But there's ways in which things overlap, and so that sort of slows the reading down a little bit. I still think, like in this piece, like I mean, I've always found these pieces quite beautiful. I still have a very hard time engaging it then more than just a stylistic thing. I still don't quite. I try to enter into it and think about like, why is that guy hanging upside down, and who are those people drowning in the hot tub? Why is the dog? But I kind of don't. I don't have a way into it. And these are the things, and so it seems still a little bit like, and I think that that's okay for you right now to just sort of try out different forms, because maybe the different attempts will allow you to make a leap where it's beyond the surface to try to, it's like art has a need for connection, right? Like, how do we connect to it? So I guess I'm wondering where you're sort of at with that, like how you're connecting with the narratives, or how you're connecting with the color or the form.
Well, it's also about the trust that the artist creates in the viewer by insisting on a certain point. You know, that if you see the artist keeps engaging with this thing, after a while you're like, no matter how improbable this may seem, this person really is taking this seriously, so I have to actually think about it. You know?
I think in order for the artist to do that, though, they have to be able to experience that
Absolutely.
thing for themselves primarily. And
Yeah.
I think that that's been the sort of initial, just like right out the gate roadblock.
Right.
Is that there's not a sort of feeling behind
Yeah.
something.
But I also respond to the one on the back there, the pen and ink one.
Yeah.
Not only, you know, the material, the thing with the pen and ink lines and the overlay, but the pattern, that sort of lacy pattern is really nice. I mean, it's something, and there's a, you know, that's been a long-running motif, you know, in all of your work, this engagement with patterns and the Persian miniatures and, you know, and maybe if, I mean, this is almost a sidebar. I mean, but it does occur to me that if you let that play out, instead of imposing the habitual imagery on it right away, if you let the, you know, open your mind of what that love of pattern generates on its own accord. It doesn't matter whether it's, you know, in quotes, abstract or figurative. It could be either one. But I think you sort of hate, you know, you're in a big hurry to populate the pattern with these familiar figures. And that shuts down the possibility of the painting. And then when you depart from that idiom completely, like in these ones, I can't feel your actual engagement with the formal experiment. Like, why is this important to him? It's not there for me, you know? I mean, it might be in the future, but it's not there yet. But your engagement with that, you know, the language you came here with is patent. But it's a question of how do you make that open up and grow instead of, you know, congeal or freeze over and shut down what the possibilities within the painting are.
I think the level, there's something that's working over here at the level of form that does bring it closer to, like I can think of exquisite Japanese drawings that were for making prints, but that remain drawings, that like Japanese like battle scenes, these long, and the bodies do kind of become these kind of repeating patterns that become shapes that move. But I also think that the way that the figures relate to narrative within the space is like really just compelling. And over here, for me, this painting, I'm really interested in the bottom half, and I'm not interested in the top half. And I was trying to think about like why, like what are the distinctions there at the level of imagery and like how it's painted. The other thing is, did you like grow up watching those like Ray Harryhausen films as a kid? Those animated films, you know what I'm talking about? It's like, you know, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad or the Clash of the Titans. He did all the animated. He's a stop motion animator. You should look at them because they're some of the most exquisite things, because it's just like stop motion skeletons, like armies of stop motion skeletons, like running after people with like swords and like it's just like, it's goofy and it's incredible that anyone did it, and it's like technically really challenging, and the pleasure of pulling off like the visual feat of it is part of its meaning, right? That the people enjoy looking at it. And so like what I like down here is that this feels to me, it reminds me a lot of Sienese painting in terms of the way that not just because of the weird green geometric architecture and like the pink figures, or that happens a lot in those paintings, that palette, but the kind of narrative, because a lot of those paintings, I don't know if you've ever looked at them, it's like Sienese Renaissance paintings, so it's like they become really influential like with modern artists because they're like dealing with structure differently, like visual structure, and I would love Professor Ellis to pick up on that later. But there's all this weird form stuff that happens where it'd be like, oh, here's a body of a kid that's chopped up, and then like 3 inches later the kid is like whole again and like flying and holding a dove, and it all happens within the space of the same picture. You get an entire narrative arc, like, oh no, this person's sick, and then they died, and then the saint came and resurrected them, or multiple versions of the same saint in the scene. And it reminds me a lot of this, like, oh no, the bodies, and then this person looks just like it's running away, and then there's a little body that looks like the dog, and there's all this form stuff that's happening that's like really exciting to look at. And almost like over there's something about this size of figure to this size of the mark on this scale of a thing that's really kind of a nice level of abstraction that I kind of lose it up here. Like this, the sky kind of feels sort of general. The like when these figures up at this size, I don't know, it's just like less interesting. Also, I think there's less of a story here. And this feels more kind of pastiche-y or something in a way that like, I know we like didn't talk to you about, you know, like appropriation or whatever, but there is a moment where it's like, okay, we're doing Hindu deities, you know what I mean? Like, oh, I guess that's okay, like, or not. And I think that if it's like not okay, like really making it not okay is like one thing, but otherwise it's like, okay, or invent something else, you know? And that's what's cool about the Ray Harryhausen stuff, is it's all this kind of like 60s exotica synth fantasia. So it'll be like pulling from, I think that, you know, whatever.
Well, there's also a Ulysses one, a really great Harryhausen Ulysses one. And he was the original animator for King Kong.
He was the guy.
Yeah, it was the stop motion stuff is awesome, but I think you would really enjoy it. I mean, it is this weird combination of kind of beautiful and kind of absurd. But picking up on the Sienese thing.
Yeah, please.
I mean, I think I don't want to go too deep in the weeds on one like sort of studio crit material in the larger crit, but I think the problem with that painting is it feels to me as if you were distracted while you were working on it. That you kind of worked on it in episodes, and the whole thing doesn't really hang together for that reason. And the chromatic ideas, which sometimes you really do these very strange and cool things with like that blue painting, you know, the one that's predominantly blue. It doesn't, it feels like it's sort of just a bunch of colors there. They don't actually combine into a chromatic idea. But I do think, yeah, I think you have looked at those Sienese paintings some, haven't you? Like Duccio or Simone Martini or no?
Maybe, I don't know, I wouldn't know.
There's some killer ones in the National Gallery. If you go to the Italian section in the early part, there's some really great ones. Yeah, but it does have this sort of fantasy narrative idiom that peculiar to itself.
But that's spatial.
Yeah, and also temporal.
Temporal.
Because one thing they love doing is like what Jarrett was describing, when there'll be a bunch of events going on, and it has to do with the life of a saint, but they're happening in different times. So even though on the painting it's all simultaneous, in the story it's happening in time. And often they use the nearer to the viewer the thing is, the more recent it is. So, you know, the past starts in deep space and comes up to the front, which is cool.
I think the problem is not so much the formal, but it's like if, you know, Duccio is gonna, there's a relationship and a feeling towards the story itself. And so if you feel some kind of rapture or something, then the way that you paint it will will come through. And the problem that we see really consistently is like nobody has talked about that. I have absolutely no idea why that is there, you know. And so I see you really trying to find some kind of rule for yourself still. The problem is not so much the rule. The problem is how do you make the leap to have an experience and to have, as you're making the drawing, to have some knowledge to be able to project yourself into the life of any of these people in there. I mean, it just doesn't, it's not, you're never gonna find a universal rule for how you make something. Why would we, then everybody's art would look the same. I mean, it just doesn't, it doesn't add up. And so until that ceases to be the plan and you find your own meaning, how do you engage with meaning? That's the problem.
And looking for that kind of meaning, there's obviously something, I mean, you know how I keep saying all the time, look at your own work to figure out what you're trying to do. Don't try to tell the work what you're doing, listen to the work.
I've got one more thing
Oh,
to
sorry,
say.
I thought you were done.
Some artists come to mind. I mean, I think one of the ways that I do find meaning in the work is in a kind of spirituality, because I think that there's a repetition of mark, which feels like mysticism. You're very interested in philosophy. So some artists that come to mind that maybe are a little bit out and, you know, maybe too abstract, because it's maybe, you know, I'm not saying to make abstract work, but an artist that comes to mind just to sort of like break the mold a little bit is a person named Hannah Darbovin, and also Dan Walsh.
Oh, yeah.
But I think
Wait,
the
just a
question,
second,
yeah,
let me just say, because I want to connect to what she was talking about.
yeah.
The thing that you have done, you know, for a long time, that you repeat, are these very intricate pattern structures, right? Forget the thing that I'm having trouble connecting with, and I think Fox is having trouble connecting with, is what is the point of the narrative? You know, what are these things really about? But one thing that they're definitely about, just based on the way that the amount of investment that you've made in it, is the intricacy of the pattern structures. So you can, and that's what I see also in, it's sort of liberated in the drawing back there. But I think that that's where I'm going back, I'm trying to restate the point I made earlier in a slightly different way. When you use your habitual iconography, it forces that motive into a certain channel, and that always emerges at the same place. But if you would start with the motive instead of the imagery and see where that leads, then it might, you know, spontaneously connect with your feelings in a way that the imagery doesn't.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and make another suggestion too, and along the lines of what everybody's already said. saying. I feel like I'm just really wondering, like, are you looking for language or terms to like set around what you're interested in? Because like I feel like something as simple as like I wonder like do you like I don't know if you ever done this like in grade school there's like when you go to write a creative writing you have to make like an idea bubble and you have to make all these legs and branches that come off. It seems silly, but it's like it's a really I think important thing to do because it's like you kind of find a lineage of like words, a lineage of like ideas when you do that.
I don't understand what you mean.
So a mind map, it's like you do a mind map.
We didn't learn how to do this. This
No,
is
I'm
something
diagramming sentences, I never heard of mine.
It's something that we have to learn how to do in schools to make creative writing. But I think like if you did that with things that you were visually attracted to, like you have camouflage, but like what is your relationship to camouflage? But it's like if you actually look into the history of it, you might find that there's some relationship that you have to it, like there's a connection there, and that might spark that interest for you. And so I think like the more you try to like
Hey, Joe?
investigate.
Joe, for the rest of the time, stop writing. I'm sure you have enough notes.
Well, I
Just-
guess it is recorded too.
It's recorded too. Just try to listen. Just try to listen.
I just feel like the more you try to investigate like your interest in these things, like it's whether it's like you come up on something aesthetically that is pleasing to you, you have to find out why why that's pleasing to you. Or if you come across something that's just cerebrally interesting, like it's something to go. You have to investigate the thing. It's like what everybody's talking about with these different characters. You have a very inventive mind, but it's like in order to create a character, it's not just about the image of the character. There's these different parts and characteristics that you build around the character in order for the character to take shape. And so like that's what like is lacking in all of these. Is like these characters don't have any real, like they're just recreations of something else that exists. Where if you really thought about that deity at the top of this thing, but you gave your own characteristics to it, and you actually developed it and worked on it over like 10 paintings, then it would say something. It might speak to you, like it would do something else. You have to let the work kind of transform you. You have to let the language transform you. But like you can't just like look at images and just like redepict them, because it's not really saying anything, unless that's what your exact interest is. But you have to know. Again, like, what is this art? Why was this created, or what is this artist using it for me to reinterpret it, to have a conversation with this other thing, and that's not really happening in the work.
Joe, so really quick, I've seen you work in your sketchbook, and I've seen you work on a painting, and you bring a different energy to your sketchbook that I think is a lot more exciting than the energy you bring to your paintings. And I think if you looked more at what you're doing in your sketchbook and how you're like activating it and how you're addressing it with your force and energy into it and brought that into your paintings, I think you'll be able to get out of this like boring like iconography that isn't yours.
Yeah, I think I mean, there's no doubt you're really good with form and drafting and like sketching, putting down these ideas, but what I see that is not there is like any sensibility to color in your works of these things that require you to look, like see, like you're looking outside, and again what Fox said about the grass being green. Like if you really looked into grass, it's not just green. It's like it has like a whole ton of colors. Like even just you look at your own self-skin, like it's not just one color. It has so many different tones. Remember we went outside with Fox in our class, we looked outside comparing all the different colors of different blocks. Everyone said different things, yellow, blue, red, even though they're just same cement blocks. Like it seems like you're not, your ability for form and jumping right into it is stopping you to actually feeling the colors, feeling what the sensation of what you see. And I guess like, we relate colors to feelings, like, red, anger, blue, sad. But that's like a really shallow level, but like I want to talk about the more abstract ones, because even though they're like not really feels like a body of work, I can feel that you're trying to be more engaged with color. You know, there's variations of colors that you're not really obligated to form as you are in this one. So you use these colors, and then even for the one in the middle where it's like stretched on this canvas weirdly with cut pieces, it's like the way the bright colors and the dark colors, it's, you know, that's like such strong sensibility to mixing colors. So I feel like from the mileage you got from those, I'm wondering, like, how is that going to work together in the future?
Well, I sort of want to leave color alone for a second and go back to what Taj was talking about. Like, I think we all sort of are working here to develop our color sensibility, and of course that's going to relate to the emotive qualities of the paintings. But I think more than sort of tackling these formal problems, again, it's going back to what Taj said. The only thing I want to add is it's not like you're really good at finding things in the world that interest you, and then sort of like riffing on them. And you're not impoverished for things or interests or topics. What's sort of missing is the distillation of how those things relate to each other. And that I think the suggestion of mind mapping is really interesting. I don't know how much writing you do. Like, I don't know if you just ever sit down and you just like write for an hour about your work or about the things that interest you. But maybe sort of tackling the kind of motivational problem in your visual work just by a different means. Like you might sort of get some traction there, and not so much like delving into the particular deity or the particular iconography, but like what is it that sort of undergirds all those things? Like if you write down a whole bunch of words on a piece of paper and you start trying to draw the lines that connect them, like what are the words that go on those lines? Like where do those connections sort of form?
Yeah, I have to add, I mean, there's something Fox mentioned before, a couple comments ago, like, I took it to mean like, essentially, like, what is your position in these pieces, right? And to me, my next question is like, why? Like, why are you making this? Why are you making this? Why are you making this, right? And it's not like the question of like, where are you in the work per se, but like, the artist has to have a position to make the work, right? And I think whatever the idea is or the position, it doesn't have to be super complex. It could be something very internal, something from your memories, but I think by just sticking to that, that's the reason that you make the work, and it'll come through. Like, we wouldn't question it as much, I think, if like your position is clearly stated. Of course, you can't state it with words, but it's almost like the reason for making the piece to begin with. And if you're really sort of embedded in that idea, you would make more than one, right? You make many, right? And this one, I mean, we talked about this a bit, but it does have, it's the most worked, and has some nice things happening in terms of like the reds and the greens, you know, and I think, or we talked about repetition, you know. In some of these, I think if you were to explore this further, it's not so much repetition and layers on top of these, it's more like 10 other ones of this move. You know, there's some part of the practice can be light and fast, right? And after you have X amount, you can look at them together, right? Or you can sequence them in that sense.
I mean, I still think color is your problem, because remember the pieces.
Okay,
Hold
we've
on.
heard that, yeah.
Yeah, also, by the way, like there's like a lot of different ways to approach color. Color functions symbolically, color functions culturally very differently.
Small paintings that he really showed.
I'm just like saying that like, sure, what you're saying about color is like a thing, but also like there's a lot of viable ways to deal with color that isn't grounded in observational local color dynamics within light and space. So, and I think that like most of the traditions in the world of world art deal with color in other terms than that, and so like that's something that's available to you. I want to I kind of want to return to the very first thing and reformulate it, because your introduction, you know, everyone has the opportunity to create a discursive or verbal framework within which we have this conversation. And what you said was, what do you think it means? And I think that framing put everything on a really mistaken trajectory. And so I hope that you can kind of later look back and think about like why this sort of went off the rails from that. But I have thoughts about it. And I even think like listening to a lot of the advice you're given is like being spoken about or addressing like what it means And I think there's like a fundamental misunderstanding of like meaning and like the role of meaning here. And it's like meaning is not, like no one is just like telling you what it means. There's not a meaning which is then being extracted from what you've done and like the secret being revealed. Meaning is like a very complicated collaboration that exists outside of the object. The art, it is like outside of the artist's intention and a collaboration between the object and the reception, and it's like cultural moment, and that thing accrues over time. Like it's not a stable thing, like what something means at any given moment. So I think meaning is like an elusive whole other category. You're not even at meaning. None of you are at meaning, frankly. What you're at is intention and subject matter. Like what's the thing that you're doing? And so a lot of the confusion is people are like, we don't know the thing that you're doing, which is not meaning. So I think maybe like pull those things apart.
Let me just interject one quick thing. You can describe a project without saying this is what the project means.
Yeah, because it's not up to you. In a way, you are humbled before the work to discover its meaning. That's the work of putting something into the world. That's the work of being in dialogue in a community, is that we discover the meaning. You understand how the implications of something exceeded what your intention was, and it's all bound up in this object. That's the complexity of this thing. It's a highly complicated construct.
That is so important. And it happens, I mean, you may have different, works of art may be meaningful to you in different ways at different times, right? The same painting can mean something different to you at 20 and at 50, you know?
And I think one of the biggest barriers right now in the space of contemporary art and criticism is there's, especially around artists who are in a position of any kind of difference, is that there's an over-determination or an over-attribution of the author's intention in determining the meaning, which is like, it's like, oh, it means this because I say it does. It's like, not really. Like, what you say is useful, it positions it in a particular place, but the thing has its own life. And if it didn't have its own life, we wouldn't all be here. We wouldn't care about this thing. And so it's not about you in a particular way. But what I want to say about the subject of these things is I think that you have a really interesting, and it's mostly see it over here, but I remember that blue painting from last semester. You are a visual storyteller in a way that's really complicated and unusual. And I think that when we talk about something like Sienese painting, like Duccio, or we're talking about Ray Harryhausen, those guys were artists who weren't making up the story. They were finding a form to retell a story in a new way, in an original way. And I think that, there's a lot of material that you could be riffing on in terms of just like the narrative, whether it's, what's the Gilgamesh, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Bible, or, weird, fucked up right-wing conspiracy theories, or, you know what I mean? It's like all of that could kind of ground like this big epic thing, and that's a big part of what artists have always done. That's what most art, religious art is. It's finding a way to communicate a story.
A pre-existing.
A pre-existing story. So I think part of the confusion here about the subject matter is whatever the story is not like a thing. And that means that it's really hard to get traction within it because it just feels random. Like, oh, this is happening, that's happening, this person's cut up, that person's cut up. It's like, if there isn't some narrative arc, even internally, it doesn't have to be literal in any way like an illustration, but like that you can kind of ground yourself on, where you're like, this happens, this happens, this happens, then it's really hard, I think, for you to find form for it. Because I think you are very gifted in form. I think the way that you use color is narrative. It's symbolic and it's storytelling. And I think that I remember seeing that in other pieces of yours that had these figures where it was like the color was doing interesting things. Like that blue painting had interesting color dynamics that were light and silvery and whatever. So, but I think that when you recognize that like, that is a tool, that's part of your tool to tell these like kind of complicated cluster, epic paintings, that'll just kind of give you a lot of clarity in terms of like how to proceed.
Okay. Cluster